Okay, good afternoon and welcome to this meeting of the Conveners Group. We've received no apologies, but I am conscious that a couple of committees are running late, so we will be joined, I think, by Audrey Nicholl later on in the meeting. And we'll probably then take Audrey's questions towards the end of the session. The meeting's being held in public, and I'd remind members that microphones will be turned on and off remotely, so you need to do nothing on this occasion. We have only one agenda item today, and that is a meeting with the First Minister, who I warmly welcome to this meeting of the Conveners Group. The meeting will last around 90 minutes. Some conveners have indicated they wish to ask a number of questions on different issues. I'll do my best to get everybody in an appropriate order, but I would appeal for brevity in questions and responses as far as possible. And without further ado, we will start on parliamentary procedures, and I'm going to invite Martin Whitfield on behalf of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee to begin questioning. Martin.
I'm grateful, Convener, and good afternoon, First Minister. I want to look at parliamentary scrutiny because obviously the committee is undertaking an inquiry into effectiveness in committees, and one of the pieces of evidence we heard was that culture trumps structure when it comes to enabling effective scrutiny. And you have quite a privileged position of having been in government, having been on the backbenches, and now indeed First Minister. So I wonder whether you would like to give us your reflections on that concept, that for effective scrutiny, culture trumps structure.
It's a fascinating question and perhaps, Presiding Officer, a rather philosophical question to start our session on, but nonetheless very important. I think I do, from the different perspectives of my involvement in Parliament, have some reflections that I think are relevant to the point that Mr Whitfield puts to me. And if I can cite the particular example that I've experienced on the Victims' Witnesses Bill that the Criminal Justice Committee has been scrutinising. I supported and endorsed that in government when I was Deputy First Minister, went through the normal cabinet process, came into Parliament as a bill. I then left government, sat on the Criminal Justice Committee and took evidence in the entirety on the bill. I have to say, I found the evidence-taking process pretty challenging because of what it challenged about the view I had held before, when I had passed the bill in good faith through Parliament. I then found myself as First Minister presiding over the developing stages of the bill, and as Mr Whitfield will know, there are quite substantial changes have been made to the contents of that bill as a consequence of the evidence that the committee took and the formulation of what I would consider to be, and I was obviously part of this, but this, as Mr Whitfield will appreciate, there are members from all parties, or most parties, on the Criminal Justice Committee. The evidence led the committee to make recommendations and come to conclusions that were challenging to the original contents of the bill. And the government, in my view, has responded substantively to those points in the proceedings. So I suppose what in looking at that particular example and addressing the question that Mr Whitfield puts to me about culture and structure, I think the culture is one of being prepared to be open and to accept that there may be different evidence that you hear over the course of a process that leads you to change your mind. So an openness about evidence taking and transparency with that discussion is important. But structural questions are important as well, in the sense that we would not have found out the issues, the concerns and the perspectives had the Criminal Justice Committee not used its structures of evidence taking to generate the evidence that it generated, which resulted in a change in government policy. So I suppose my answer to Mr Whitfield's core question is that it's a bit of both. It's culture and structure, but crucially, there has to be a willingness to engage in the consideration of evidence, which I think is one of the strengths of the parliamentary committee system.
Thank you.
Thank you. Having put you at your ease with a philosophical question, can I discombobulate you by acknowledging the presence of pupils from Breadalbane Primary School, or Breadalbane Academy, indeed, from Aberfeldy. So you are being closely watched, First Minister.
If I may, and I'm really now going to take my life in my hands with what I'm about to do, but it would be commonly known as Breadalbane Academy, presiding officer, if I may say so, in the wonderful town of Aberfeldy in my constituency. So I've probably absolutely shot myself in the foot. But to the young people of Breadalbane Academy who actually grilled me a couple of weeks ago in advance of their trip here, they can see if I'm any more accomplished in the parliamentary committee chambers as I was in the Assembly Hall of Breadalbane Academy.
I will stand corrected. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to move to Finlay Carson on behalf of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee. I think you have a question about sort of procedures, but then on some core business for the
Absolutely, Convener, and thanks for allowing me to come in a supplementary on committee effectiveness. This morning, First Minister, the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee was forced to drop consideration of the Good Food Nation plan. It's a plan that we had anticipated scrutinising since the Framework Bill at the start of the session. But because it's been laid at a time when we'll be considering two government bills, a significant package of CAP replacement SSIs, the budget process, the climate change plan, it's impossible. And that's not to mention two members' bills that we already have. And we've already took the decision to drop consideration of the draft island plan. So my question is, what can you and the Scottish Government do to avoid this workload overload that comes almost inevitably at the end of each session to make sure that there can be effective committee and parliamentary scrutiny of legislation?
There certainly at all times should be effective committee scrutiny of all legislation and parliamentary instruments. That is, in my view, essential to enable us to make good law and to specify the conclusions of that process. I accept that there will be congestion in different parts of the parliamentary system. There will be areas of policy that attract greater scrutiny and a greater requirement for legislative change than others, which is inevitable. Obviously, Parliament is free to consider whether it needs to put in place supplementary arrangements for the scrutiny of some of that material at different stages in the past. Parliament, I recall, decided to create two justice committees, if my memory serves me right, to consider the degree of activity that was going on. So I think what I would say to Mr Carson is that the Government will, of course, respond to any arrangements that Parliament decides to put in place to enable that scrutiny to take place. The Government should not be the determinants of that. We should serve that in whatever decisions Parliament makes. But obviously there will be areas where we have an intensity of activity in one policy area which may lead to the congestion that Mr Carson raises with me. But what I would give the Conveners Group the assurance about is the Government will always respond to any demand from Parliament to enable that scrutiny to take place.
And I guess it's about the Government recognising the capacity of the Parliament to deal with the legislation. In the moment, as I say, September and October this year, there's just not enough hours in the week, whether we sit more times or not. So it's a request that the Government recognise the limitations of the Parliament, particularly given the increase in the number of framework bills, which necessitates more scrutiny of SSIs and secondary legislation that comes on the back of that.
I'm certainly very happy to consider those issues, and as a consequence of this session, I'll ask the Minister for Parliamentary Business to engage with the Parliamentary Bureau on those questions.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to another question. The Rural Affairs Committee looked into the Scottish Human Rights Commission's report, which highlights significant issues with housing, hunger and access to health services in the Highlands and Islands. And I would imagine the same conclusions will be arrived at when they do a similar piece of work in the south of Scotland. In the previous meeting in the Conveners Group with yourself, I highlighted the fact that rural areas barely merited a mention in the Scottish Government's national outcomes. So how will the Scottish Government ensure a comprehensive approach to improving the quality of life and protecting human rights, not just in the Highlands and Islands, but across rural Scotland? And what immediate actions can the Scottish Government do to address these urgent human rights concerns?
There's obviously different ways of considering some of these questions. The questions on human rights which have been raised by the Scottish Human Rights Commission, I'm familiar with the work that Mr Carson raises with me, and the issues about the meeting of individuals' rights in that context in Highlands and Islands, I think especially in Argyll and Bute was the focus of much of that research, is applicable across the whole of Scotland. So whether it's urban or rural, island or mainland, it is absolutely essential that people's rights are addressed and fulfilled, and the government acts in a fashion to do so. That is then reflected in the national outcomes framework that we bring forward, so that Parliament can hold the government to account on its performance in meeting those national outcomes. Now, I understand the point that Mr Carson is putting to me, that there is perhaps a need to look at that from a rural perspective. I tend to take a different view, because I believe the rights that individuals should have access to apply in all geographies of the country. And I wouldn't want that answer to be interpreted in any way as diminishing the importance of ensuring that people's rights in rural areas are addressed. And some of the specific circumstances that arise out of the Scottish Human Rights Commission's report about Argyll and Bute, about access to housing, for example, are particular challenges that government policy has got to reflect and address. And in the dialogue that we will have with the Scottish Human Rights Commission, we will address very specifically those policy priorities. But when it comes to assessing the achievement of outcomes, I think it's more appropriate for us to ensure that is tested and assessed across the whole of the country.
I understand that, but you know, we've got examples of women in my constituency having to travel 70 miles to give birth, and you know, the report specifically highlights significant issues in rural areas. So is it something you would consider integrating the recommendations from this human rights report and subsequent ones looking at rural areas and actually, you know, integrate them into the national outcome framework?
I certainly think that we're operating perhaps at two levels here. There are very legitimate and real issues raised by the Scottish Human Rights Commission report about the experience of individuals in rural areas, and the government's got an obligation to address those in policy terms. There is then the holding of the government to account on the achievement of the national outcomes, which is part of the analysis in the National Performance Framework. And again, I am very happy for the government to be held to account in that respect. If there are different ways we can report to Parliament on progress on certain questions, I'm happy to do so. The specific example about the maternity care arrangements in Mr Carson's constituency, you know, I've looked at, Mr Carson's raised that with me at First Minister's questions. I've looked at this issue, and the judgments that are arrived at by the government are arrived at based on the clinical advice that is made available to us. And we should engage on what is the detail of those stances. And Parliament, of course, is free to challenge the government on the conclusions that it makes, as Mr Carson has done to me on previous occasions.
Okay, thank you. And finally, my final question, Convener. The co-design process for the replacement of CAP, the agriculture support, has faced considerable criticism from various stakeholders. Despite the intention to create a collaborative and inclusive approach, there's real concerns about its effectiveness, and stakeholders have expressed frustration over a lack of clear communication and tangible outcomes. So, for example, a former NFUS president described the Agriculture Reform Implementation Oversight Board, ARIOB, which was established to implement policy reform, described it as a fig leaf for not doing anything, indicating that it had become a way to pretend to engage with industry without making real progress. So, given these concerns, can you explain why the co-design process is not working effectively for new agricultural policies, and what steps your government will take to address these issues to ensure meaningful engagement and, more importantly, progress?
I part company with Mr Carson on the conclusions of the co-design process. I think the co-design process is a really valuable part of working with the agricultural sector on managing a transition from the Common Agricultural Policy to the new agricultural support arrangements. And, government often gets criticised for perhaps deciding for itself and not engaging with others. Well, on this occasion, we've engaged with others and we've been criticised for doing exactly that. Now, I do accept that there will be different views about what should be the outcome of the agricultural review process, and there will be stakeholders who think the government has been far too sympathetic to the farming industry. I accept that that will be one criticism that will be put to the government, but there will be others within the farming community who will say that the government's done absolutely the right thing by working collaboratively with the farming sector through the Agricultural Reform Implementation Oversight Board. So I think those structures, I think, are appropriate for the type of transition that we've got to make to a new regime of agricultural support. There may be others there may be voices that think we should do other things, and of course that's democracy.
But it's not necessarily about the
We are going to have to make progress, I'm afraid. On that basis, I'm going to call Jackson Carl on behalf of the Citizen Participation and Public Petitions Committee.
First Minister, both the questions I hope to ask arise out of petitions that have been with the Parliament. Both of them are petitions where we are either at an impasse or are concerned we're running out of time in this Parliament, perhaps advance the aims of the petition. The first one I raise is on behalf of my very good friend Stanley. Stanley is a golden eagle. And poor Stanley has been unable to fly for the last 3 years in fear of arrest for perhaps lifting a hair on the wrong side of an invisible line which has been drawn by Parliament in relation to his flight and going about his normal business. Now, this is petition number 1859, retain Falklands' rights to practice upland falconry in Scotland. And the petitioner Barry Blyther brought this issue to the committee following the passage of the Animal and Wildlife Penalties, Protections and Powers Scotland Act 2020. An amendment was brought forward at stage 3, which reclassified mountain hares as protected wild animals which may not be intentionally or recklessly killed, injured or taken. The original intention, as argued in Parliament, was in relation to men with guns. Because there was no evidence taken, the consequence for birds of prey was not properly established. And Barry and other falconers have felt the impact of this amendment. He argues that an exemption should be made for falconry on the basis that it is a historic practice and birds of prey take a minuscule number of mountain hares. But due to the late introduction of the amendment, he and falconers did not have the opportunity to have their voices heard. So there are two issues. Does the First Minister recognise the impact that substantial stage 3 amendments can have on scrutiny and the unforeseen consequences that may arise as a consequence? And is there a way to identify a route for an appropriate exemption for falconry? In other words, will you free Stanley?
Well, I think I might be on safer ground if I address the procedural question of substantive stage 3 amendments.
Safer, perhaps, but that won't help Stanley.
Well, perhaps, but Mr Carlow will understand my desire to stay on safe ground this afternoon. I think the question that's raised, the procedural question underpinning this, is significant, of major topics coming in at stage 3 where evidence has not been taken. And now sometimes the government does that, although I would personally be not very supportive of doing that, because I think the parliamentary processes are set up for good reason, that we should take evidence in good time at stage 1, reflect on those issues and then work our way through the detail at stage 2 and stage 3. Major questions coming in at stage 3 without appropriate evidence is, I think, undesirable. And I would, members may be able to quote examples where the government has done that to refute what I'm about to say, but generally I would not be keen on the government doing that. But of course members of Parliament are free, subject to the decisions of the presiding officer about selection of amendments as to whether such procedures are taken forward at stage 3. So generally I don't think it's a good idea to do that without evidence. On the question of the substantive issue about the position of falconry, there are exemptions, there are licences that can be granted by Nature Scot to cover this issue which I think is the response the government has given to the committee, that there is a means by which the issue that Mr Carlow puts to me can be addressed under existing arrangements through the pursuit of a licence. That doesn't mean to say the licence will be granted, of course, which will be part of the concern that I think the individual that's raised this issue with the committee will be concerned about. Now, of course, there may well be other legislative vehicles that could be used to change, because that will be primary legislation that will have to be changed. So there may be other legislative vehicles, but of course we would have to watch there that we don't get into the same trap of making a substantive Stage 3 amendment to a bill where we haven't taken evidence, and we also might get into trouble with Mr Carson about the number of legislative issues that we're bringing forward to Parliament.
Well, you'd have to choose between Mr Carson and myself as to who you're going to get into the most trouble with, First Minister. But I know the government are working on guidelines that might assist this proposal, but we haven't really seen them emerge. Is it possible that you could, from here, seek to give a little bit of push to those guidelines coming forward? And would you agree to meet Stanley, were he to revisit the Parliament in early course?
That feels like a very high risk encounter for me. So what I will do, I'll take the safer option of agreeing to look into the question that Mr Carlow puts to me, and I'll write. I think I should probably write to the Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'll copy that to Mr Carlow.
Thank you. We'll leave Stanley in limbo for now. We'll move on to net zero energy and transport, and I'm going to invite Ariane Burgess on behalf of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee to kick off.
Thanks, Convener. So my question is around the Heat and Buildings Bill. So the committee's been anticipating the introduction of the bill on heat and buildings. Proposals for this were consulted on from November 2023 until March 2024. And the Climate Change Committee described this as a potential template for the rest of the UK. It said the Scottish Government should provide a timeline and avoid delays on the Heat and Buildings Bill and move towards its delivery. And while we're aware that there will be a ministerial statement on the bill next week, we've heard that the bill will not be introduced in the form outlined in the consultation. And it's been a year since the consultation on the proposed legislation closed. And First Minister, why has the analysis of the consultation responses taken so long, and how does this align with the Climate Change Committee's advice to avoid delays?
The government's obviously got to bring forward proposals that we believe will satisfy our policy objectives, and the concern which I've explained to Parliament in answers to questions at First Minister's questions have been around the impact on this area of policy, not just of the consultation responses that we have had, but also the significant increase in energy prices that we've experienced and the implications of all of that for the measures to deliver the transition that's required on heat and buildings. And what the Cabinet Secretary and I have been anxious to set out is to bring forward a bill that will deliver tangible benefits to individuals and to take the effective action on climate that we need to take, but which will not have a negative impact on poverty, and especially fuel poverty. And it's that careful balance that we are wrestling with, which will be the subject of the statement to Parliament by the Cabinet Secretary.
I appreciate that response. And the committee's heard that the delay has been detrimental to public and private sector landlords' ability to plan for the new requirements, which is going to impact delivery. And there's confusion about what will be required and by what deadline. So I'd be interested to understand what discussions you've had with the housing sector to provide assurances on this.
Well, there's obviously been a range of discussions that have taken place on all issues in connection with fuel poverty and housing issues. We're obviously taking forward substantial legislation on housing legislative reform in addition to the heat and buildings legislation. So there's been a variety of dialogue that has taken place in that respect, and we will draw on that as we formulate the proposals that we bring forward to Parliament.
Okay, thank you for that response. You've mentioned fuel poverty a number of times as being the reason for delaying the bringing forward of the legislation. And I'd be interested to understand if you were aware, so currently there's a very strong focus on air source heat pumps as the technology that we need to move to. But something that's come to light in our committee, we've been taking evidence recently on how we can actually heat buildings properly and tackle damp and mould, is solar thermal as a way to go forward in terms of tackling fuel poverty and giving people an option to heat their homes more affordably than potentially air source heat pumps. So would the First Minister consider looking at that as you look into this piece of legislation?
I think we've got to be open as part of the action on climate to the various developments that will take place that assist us in that journey. And I think in the question that Ariane Burgess puts to me, and I understand the importance of the points that are being raised, in a sense illustrate the fact that we are in a space where there is development of options and opportunities as part of the journey that we are on. And some of the strengths of individual technologies will change over time and new developments will apply. So we have to be open to those developments, which means that the legislative arrangements we put in place must be able to withstand any change or development in the system, and we have to give that careful consideration.
Thanks.
I am going to ask Edward Mountain on behalf of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee.
Thanks, Convener. Good afternoon, First Minister. First Minister, do you share my concerns that we're in a sort of situation where the committee is being asked to look at a climate change plan with very little time to do so? If I can remind you, we will get the carbon budgets delivered to us on the 21st of May. We'll then have a short period before recess to consider them when we're also doing stage 2 of the land reform bill. And then we'll get a climate change plan laid probably in draft form in September, which will affect every single, well, not every single, but the majority of committees around this table who will be expected to feed into it, which will then result in because of the 120-day deadline imposed by the Climate Change Act 2009 amended, that we'll have to report back to the government by the end of January, who then barely have a month to respond to the committee and then debate it in the Parliament, just as the Parliament's considering going into an election in 2026, which is exactly where we were in 2021, which resulted in a climate change plan which was unachievable and had to be scrapped. So I have real concerns. Do you share my concerns, First Minister, that the Parliament's being rushed and not being given the time it needs to go through this climate change plan, which is going to be a major change to previous ones we've looked at?
It doesn't strike me that the Parliament is being rushed. I do accept that the Parliament has been asked to consider issues quite close up to the dissolution before the election. And I can't remember all of the dynamics of the run-up to 2021, but in a sense, on this question, I think there is a necessity for Parliament to undertake its consideration and its scrutiny of these issues to the highest possible standard of good intention across Parliament. Now, I've seen legislation on climate passed by Parliament which the government marshalled the evidence to Parliament which said that climate change targets that were being proposed to be voted on in Parliament were unachievable, but Parliament considered that it was better to not follow the government and the Climate Change Committee's advice on that question and proceed to legislate for those targets which Parliament then had to unpick when they were not achieved. Now, in my humble opinion, I don't think that's particularly good practice in Parliament. I think we've got on questions like this where I think we all know that we've got to act on climate. I think there is, one of the strengths of Parliament has been a general cross-party view that climate action is required. I think we should do that in a dispassionate, considered fashion and perhaps not succumb to any of the temptations of coming to decisions that might be affected by impending elections or otherwise.
Well, I think you understand fully, First Minister, what I've said by what you've just said, that we are potentially in the situation where we will be considering a climate change plan with the temptation to make it such that it appeals to the electorate rather than what can be achieved. And this climate change plan will actually bind the hands of governments for at least the next 2 sessions.
But my argument there would be there's no absolute requirement on Parliament to behave in that fashion. If I think about other issues, you know, in the run-up to the 2021 elections, Parliament considered, in my view, in a completely rational, dispassionate fashion, some of the really complex issues around about the redress bill that I brought to Parliament in the run-up to the 2021 election. And I suppose in that there was a temptation that members of Parliament could have acted there to appeal to the electorate in a forthcoming election, but chose not to. And we ended up with what I think is very robust legislation. So I suppose the decision on these issues is in the hands of members of Parliament.
Just very briefly, I would say in response to that, First Minister, it would be beholden, I think, to your government and to you to do as much as they can to make sure responses from the government in relation to climate, carbon budgets and the Parliament as quickly as possible, so the Parliament have as much time to respond.
And I accept that obligation. Just
a final question then, First Minister. The government policy is to reduce the amount of car miles by 20%, but figures just out suggest that these are in fact rising. How's the government going to respond to this increase in car use, especially in rural areas where public transport is being cut?
We have to, we have to invest in alternatives that will enable people to avoid car use. So there are a variety of interventions that we make. There are substantial amounts of public expenditure utilised to support the provision of bus services. The concessionary travel scheme raises significant opportunities for travel. There is wider public subsidy for public transport within urban and rural Scotland. And then, of course, there are the various measures that we take to invest in the sustainable travel opportunities that we now see increasing around the country. So the government will take forward a range of measures to try to encourage that shift of travel from cars into more sustainable modes of travel. But I recognise that to be one of the most challenging aspects of our climate change agenda.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. We now move on to Intergovernmental Relations, Europe and External Affairs, and invite Stuart McMillan on behalf of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee.
Thank you, Convener. First Minister, in the course of considering delegated powers in LCMs, the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee is interested in how this Parliament scrutinises the choices of Scottish ministers to consent to UK ministers making secondary legislation in devolved competence. Now, while SI Protocol 2 covers these powers in former EU areas, there is no formal mechanism in place for other areas where the UK ministers can make secondary legislation in devolved competence. And the committee has now considered a number of such powers in LCMs. Now, we are aware the Scottish Government has said it will consider with the UK Government the possibility of extension of SIP 2 beyond Brexit-related powers or alternative flexible and proportionate arrangements to govern notification to the Parliament of consent decisions, allowing for scrutiny to take place. Are you aware of any progress on discussions between the Scottish and UK Governments in this particular area, and can you update this Conveners Group 1?
Obviously, the Government shares the concerns that have been expressed by the Committee and by Parliament on this matter, and this arises out of the changes to legislative arrangements that arise out of the Brexit process and the arrangements that were put in place by the last United Kingdom Government on the Internal Market Act and various other issues in relation to the scrutiny of legislation arising out of Brexit. Now, what I would hope is, there's a gap in the point that Mr McMillan raises with me, and I think it gets to the heart of the decision-making competence of this Parliament, which I think Mr Macmillan will know my view and the Government's view is that that has been eroded by the Internal Market Act and the subsequent legislative arrangements put in place as a consequence of Brexit. And the issue that Mr Macmillan raises with me is essentially a second-tier question of that, which relates to statutory instruments. Now, these issues will be considered as part of the review of the Internal Market Act that the United Kingdom Government has commissioned. And the Government has made clear our frustration at the way in which the United Kingdom Government proposes to go about this review. For example, the position of this Parliament is that the Internal Market Act should be revoked. That is not one of the options that is being considered by the United Kingdom Government in the consultation exercise. Indeed, that has been expressly ruled out. And I see no need for there to be an Internal Market Act. I can see plenty of rational arguments for common frameworks, and the Scottish Government has indicated to the UK Government our willingness to take part in substantive discussions about the contents of those common frameworks. But the questions that Mr Macmillan raises with me will all be tied up with that review of the Internal Market Act, in which the Scottish Government is actively engaged with the UK Government, but it hasn't yet reached any conclusions.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Thank you. And the second area is on the quality of SSIs, which have been withdrawn and relayed. There really has been a notable increase in the number of SSIs in the Scottish Government. Well, the Scottish Government has withdrawn recently as a result of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee raising concerns about their technical and legal accuracy, with 4 examples of this happening between December and February. Now, this compares to just one instance in the same period last year. Now, we will be raising this with the Minister for Parliamentary Business when he comes in front of us next Tuesday. But what more can the Scottish Government do to ensure that SSIs are drafted to a high standard in the first place?
Well, they should be drafted to the highest standard, and the idea of submitting an SSI and then withdrawing it because there's an error or having to address that will be a source of profound embarrassment. So, as First Minister, I certainly wouldn't want to be presented with advice which said to me, we have put in an SSI and we're having to withdraw it because we've got it wrong. I can assure the group of conveners that that is an undesirable piece of news to be put in my inbox. So, what I would say to Mr Macmillan is that the Government strives to ensure that all material is accurate as submitted to Parliament, but I don't think it's in any way acceptable for us to look at the fact that there have been 4 instances over a 3-month period when there was only 1 instance of that in a comparable period. Now, I hope that is an exception, but I think the point that Mr Macmillan puts to me is one that I will take away and discuss with the Minister for Parliamentary Business to ensure that the material we're submitting to Parliament is of the highest degree of accuracy, to avoid the committee or any other committee being put to the inconvenience of having to revisit issues because the Government has got it wrong.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you.
I'm conscious of the number of colleagues and questions that need to be covered before we get to 1:30. So be keen for the pace to be picked up just a little bit. With that, I call Claire Adamson on behalf of the Constitution, Europe, External Affairs and Culture Committee. Claire.
So, in the interest of brevity, Convener, I think what I'll say is that our committee is about to publish its report by the deadline of the 3rd of April on the review of EUKIMA. And I just wondered, First Minister, if you had any other priorities not already mentioned in your responses to Mr Macmillan about the Government's priorities for that review.
I essentially, my objective in that review is to see the restoration of the powers of the Scottish Parliament. That's my objective. And I think that has to be served by the revocation of the Internal Market Act, because I think that was a malicious piece of legislation that undermined the Scottish Parliament and, for that matter, the Welsh Senate as well. And that view is shared by the First Minister of Wales. So that's my objective, and the Government is engaging in that process to do so. I think I would consider, and I appreciate I'm not objective in all of this, but I think the conduct of the Scottish Government demonstrate in handling these issues on an intergovernmental basis demonstrates that we don't need an Internal Market Act. We need good processes of intergovernmental working. And we've committed ourselves to working towards those. On many occasions, we've seen an enhancement of the engagement of the United Kingdom Government on those questions since the election in July of last year. And I would have thought that should build confidence in the United Kingdom Government that the Internal Market Act is not in fact required, but that common frameworks agreed mutually between governments is the most effective way forward.
Thank you very much. If I could move to the Ukrainian resettlement programme that we have and the government support for that. When Consul of Ukraine Andrei Madzianovsky spoke to the committee last month, he was positive about the support in terms of the structural aspects and stated that Scottish institutions provided people with access to learning English, social security payments and the ability to work in a job so that they can feed and sustain their family. And I thank the Scottish Government and our local authority partners for that response. However, there still exists something the committee raised at the very start of the programme, and that's mutual recognition for professionally qualified Ukrainians who are here. That's so teachers, medical practitioners, architects, etc. And I just wonder if the Scottish Government has made further approaches to the UK Government on how we can address this so that the people that are here have the ability to work in their profession and, of course, fill a great skills gap in Scotland.
The work that we've taken forward has been a combination of dialogue with the UK Government on this question, but also dialogue with the professional bodies in Scotland to try to make headway on these questions. Now, there will, of course, be, in almost all of these circumstances, where it's professional body regulation, that will be out with the control of the government. We can encourage, we can engage, but ultimately it's for professional bodies to come to those judgments, which protects the integrity of the professional bodies and the work that they undertake. So I give Claire Adamson the assurance that we work constructively in that respect to ensure that the talent that's available in the country can actually be used within the country.
Thank you, First Minister. And finally, if I can reflect on the recent visit of the Deputy Convener, myself, to the PPA in Brussels. The outcome document from that meeting included a need for both the UK and UK to facilitate travel for touring artists to the maximum extent possibly and establish, and this is EU parlance at the moment, establish a youth opportunity scheme. I realise that will send a shiver around those of us of a certain age in the room, but that's what they're calling this sort of youth exchange, and for that to include apprenticeships as well. So what efforts have the Scottish Government made to both the EU and to the UK Government in seeking to support the delivery of these two objectives?
Principally, the Scottish Government, these issues are essentially tied up in the resetting of the relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union. And in that respect, we have been offering a number of what I consider to be constructive suggestions to the UK Government about how that matter can be advanced. I know from my dialogue with the European Union's ambassador to the United Kingdom and also the ambassador community from the European Union to the United Kingdom, with whom I've had separate discussions on recent visits to London, there is a willingness to consider some of these youth mobility schemes. They are, of course, the subject to some of the strategic dialogue between the UK and the European Union on the resetting of those relationships. But I can assure Claire Adamson that the Scottish Government is taking an encouraging and positive approach to ensuring that we have some of these opportunities available to us.
Thank you, First Minister. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks, Claire. Now we're moving on to Economy and Skills, and I call Colin Smith on behalf of the Economy and Fair Work Committee.
Thank you, Convener. First Minister, as we speak, the UK Chancellor is delivering the spring statement. It's no secret that's likely to include a multi-billion-pound uplift in defence spending from April. Now, Scotland's obviously a real hub when it comes to the defence sector, and more spent by the UK Government per head of population in defence contracts in Scotland and anywhere else in the UK. So what action is the Scottish Government planning to take to ensure that Scottish businesses can take full advantage of those defence investment growing opportunities that will exist after the spring statement?
We obviously mandate the enterprise agencies to work with the business community in Scotland to enable the business community to realise economic opportunities and investment opportunities. So that support is available to the relevant companies. We have, particularly on the question of armaments issues, we obviously have a policy position that we do not financially support the generation, the production of weapons and munitions, and Scottish Enterprise, Hans Enterprise and South of Scotland Enterprise will apply the necessary scrutiny of any applications for support against those policy intentions.
One of the challenges the sector faces, like many sectors, is the issue of a big skills gap. It's the issue that the economy are currently considering at the moment. 5 years ago, the number of modern apprenticeships in Scotland was nearly 28,000. Now, demand is increasing, but last year the number of modern apprenticeships was just 25,000, so fewer than a few years ago. There are more graduate apprenticeships in Manchester than there are in the whole of Scotland. Now, given that skills gap, why do we seem to undervalue that investment in apprenticeships, where we have significant success rate when it comes to the outcomes for those primarily young people?
I think if we look back over a longer period of time, we'll find that we are actually utilising more modern apprenticeships now than we have done historically. Now, I appreciate the numbers Mr Smith has put into me about recent years, but if we go back to when the government came to office, for example, I think modern apprenticeship numbers is probably of the order of 15,000 per annum, so we're significantly higher than we have been historically. I value enormously the apprenticeship programme. I think the developments that we've brought forward of encouraging the development of the foundation and graduate apprenticeship routes have been real strengths for the Scottish economy, and we have to work constructively with the business community to enable them to realise all of these potential opportunities.
As you say, though, First Minister, the numbers are obviously smaller than they were just a few years ago. But on defence spend opportunities, what role do you think that the shipyard that the government owned, Ferguson's, will play in benefiting from that spend? I mean, you aren't awarding contracts for ferries to the yard, but will they be able to benefit from the investment in defence from the UK government? Is that part of the plan?
That may well be part of the opportunities that emerge for Ferguson's, and the government is obviously supporting the development of the Ferguson's business plan to ensure the yard has got a sustainable future.
But at the moment you're not in possession of a business plan for Ferguson's that includes any substantial work beyond the completion of the Glenrosa.
Well, there's obviously a number of business prospects that Ferguson's are pursuing, and we remain very optimistic that the yard has a secure future, which is why the government has invested over £14 million in enhancing the capacity and the capability of the yard.
Okay. And as well as Ferguson's, another major business the government own with an aim to return it to the private sector is Prestwick Airport. It was bought more than a decade ago. It is making a profit, but the amount owed to the taxpayer for loans is rising every year. Are you aware of any active bids at the moment for Prestwick Airport to return it to the private sector, which is the government's ambition?
I am, and that's a matter that's currently under very active consideration.
And are we likely to see an outcome to those considerations in the near future?
I can't quite recall exactly the stage these discussions and processes are at, but if there is more information I can share with the group, I will write to the presiding officer and to Mr Smith on that, but these are very active and live issues at the present moment.
But you're optimistic we'll see that return to the private sector soon?
But that's the government's policy intention.
Okay.
appreciate the brevity of the questions and indeed the responses, but we will need to move on to Richard Leonard on behalf of the Public Audit Committee.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Good afternoon, First Minister. On the 7th of February, the Scottish Government shared with the Public Audit Committee, under the heading Transparency Review, documents relating to public expenditure on the Ferguson Marine Yard. Some of the documents prepared by the Dutch-owned consultancy First Marine International, paid for by public money, were so heavily redacted that they were useless and meaningless. So we accept, of course, that there are commercial sensitivities that need to be protected because we all want to see the yard succeed, but should it be up to a private, overseas-owned consultancy business to determine what are national sensitivities?
I'd have to check where the redactions were made to the report, because I'd be surprised if the government hadn't considered the issues of commercial sensitivity in the submission of those documents to the committee. But Mr Leonard may be able to answer my question in my mind about that.
Well, the Director General Economy passed the documents over to us with a covering letter from First Marine International, where they said that on grounds they had set, the documents were to be redacted. I mean, to such an extent, for example, that even the terms of reference for the study were in part redacted. I mean, would you be prepared to go and ask the new Permanent Secretary or the Director General Economy to revisit the redactions policy on those documents? I think
I'm pretty certain that Mr Leonard, the premise of his question is the acceptance that there will be issues of commercial sensitivity, and that to that point is not in dispute. I think there is a legitimate question about whether there is that has been applied too widely, and I'll take that issue away and give it some further consideration.
Thank you.
Because I think committees need to be given as much information as it is possible to disclose. I do, there will be commercial sensitivities, but we also have to, there are also other ways of, for example, if my memory serves me right, and the convener of the Finance and Public Administration Committee will correct me if I'm wrong here, but when it comes to, for example, information on contingent liabilities that are presented to the Finance Committee, that is done in private and those documents are never published. So there are ways in which information can be shared more fully with parliamentary committees, and those issues on contingent liability will be of commercial sensitivity.
Thank you. And on a brighter note, the same bundle of documents that contained that FMI report also had a report by a different firm of consultants looking at what happened at BIFAB from 2023, which included very few redactions and a very interesting summary of recommendations which it thought the government should follow, which included identifying key sectors in the Scottish economy, introducing a standardised triage process for intervention requests, the establishment of an independent panel to provide challenge and review of industrial interventions, and the establishment, as they describe it, of a shareholder function. Do you plan to implement any of these recommendations from that report?
I think these recommendations are at the heart of the decision-making about what should be the basis of the government's intervention in any moments of industrial distress. And we will face these issues from time to time, as we have done on a number of issues, on Ferguson's, on BIFAB, on Prestwick Airport, on the DL and Steelworks and Lochaber plant. And the government has responded, I think, responsibly in the public interest. There may be, there is an argument without a doubt for there to be a more systemic approach to that rather than a response based on individual particular case studies. That might provide more reassurance in the economy, but obviously there will be questions about the scale of what the government is able to do at particular times and various other legitimate legal questions that we have to consider significantly on the justification for any intervention that's made by the state. But I think having a deeper understanding of the process of that engagement would help in that decision making.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Move on to health and call Claire Hockey on behalf of the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and good afternoon, First Minister. And before I start, I'll put on record my register of interests. I hold a bank nurse contract with the NHS Group Glasgow and Clyde. We know that third sector organisations play a vital role in delivering social care across Scotland, a lifeline for many individuals and families, and the effects of the Westminster Government's plan to increase employer national insurance contributions will be absolutely devastating for some of those caring organisations and potentially discourage employers from recruiting extra staff. Can the First Minister advise what assessment the Scottish Government has made of the implications that this tax on jobs will have on social care providers?
Our estimate of the cost in the social care sector is of the order of £84 million would be the cost of the employers' national insurance contribution increases on the sector. Now, obviously, that is a significant cost, and the amelioration of it will depend on the level of contract payment that is made principally through health and social care partnerships at local level, and that's a subject of very active dialogue at the present moment with representative organisations, and it's considered also through the work that's undertaken by the Collaborative Response and Assurance Group that is led by the Health Secretary and by the COSLA Health spokesperson, Councillor Kelly, where we look at those implications, because the possible implications of those increased costs could be to make it more difficult to deliver social care, and we are hugely dependent on an efficient and effective social care system to meet the needs of members of the public within Scotland. So there are some very real threats. Now, I've obviously been in this gathering, so I don't know if there's been any update from the Chancellor's statement on any further amelioration for the employers' national insurance contribution increases, but I'll obviously be briefed on that when I conclude this appearance.
Thank you. So the recent budget, the Scottish Government said it will deliver a record £2 billion increase in frontline NHS spending, taking overall health and social care investment to £21 billion. First Minister, how do you anticipate that this will improve outcomes for patients across Scotland, in particular in reducing waiting times in elective surgery?
That essentially is the reduction in waiting times in outpatient and inpatient appointments, and also improving access to healthcare services, principally through services in the primary care sector, through GPs and other allied health professionals, is really the focus of the Government's planning to improve performance in the National Health Service. These were the themes that I set out in the speech that I delivered on National Health Service priorities on the 27th of January, and they'll be reflected in the operational guidance that is being given by the Health Secretary to health boards. In addition to that, we are working across all NHS boards in Scotland to optimise the capacity of the health service to ensure that we make as much progress on reducing waiting times. And we are beginning to see the fruits of that with increases in the procedures that are undertaken, the £30 million that was made available in this financial year to help to reduce waiting times, set out a number of procedures that we expected to be undertaken for that resource, and we have already exceeded that, and the financial year has not yet concluded. So I'm optimistic that we are beginning to see the emergence of some of the erosion of those unacceptably long waiting times that are taking place. But obviously the budget that Parliament has approved will help us to intensify that effort in the coming financial year.
Presiding Officer, thank you. So my final question, First Minister, is about the winter vaccination programme. I think we were all very worried at the latter end of last year about the rise in flu cases and the subsequent hospitalisation. So I'm wondering if any assessment's been done on the impact that the winter vaccination programme had on bringing down those flu infection rates, and what lessons will be learned for next winter?
I think there's 2 points I'd make there. I think amongst the population groups where there is perhaps the highest degree of vulnerability amongst care home residents and those aged over 75, the levels of vaccination were really quite high. 83% of care home residents, 80% of those aged over 75, and obviously we do work to try to improve those levels at all times. We faced particular challenges from flu this year. The pressure on the health service from mid-December to mid-January was of extraordinary proportions compared to recent years, and indeed the most recent extraordinary period, which would be at the Christmas, New Year 22-23, was exceeded by the issues that we faced in this Christmas and New Year period. We're obviously seeing substantial decline in that prevalence of flu, and that's enabling the system to recover some of the lost capacity that was experienced as a consequence of the scale of the flu outbreak that we experienced.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now going to call Jackson Carlo again.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I just, before I do, say that I am very concerned at the way some of the children who were sitting behind the First Minister have been targeted on social media by some journalists. I think it's completely inappropriate, and I would ask the journalists to consider removing the posts they've put up. I think that's absolutely disgraceful. The Citizens Participation and Public Petitions Committee receives petitions on a wide range of issues and often pursues matters with the Scottish Government that it might not have otherwise considered. One example of this is petition number PE 1911 to review of Human Tissue Scotland Act 2006 as it relates to post-mortems. Now, this petition was lodged by Anne Stark following the unexpected loss of her 21-year-old son, Richard Stark, and I want to pay tribute to Anne because she has absolutely relentlessly pursued the aims of this petition now for some time. Anne's campaigning has led her to raise concerns about the inconsistent and unclear communication about investigations into unexpected deaths. And my committee has heard about specific improvements that could be made, including the use of CT scanners for non-invasive post-mortems, offering more of a choice for loved ones regarding the return of tissue samples. These CT scanners are now being used in other parts of the United Kingdom quite widely. Now, we've raised several of Anne's points with the Scottish Government, with the Lord Advocate and the Royal College of Pathology, but we found a lack of drive to address the concerns raised or to consider the suggested service improvements. With frequent suggestions, unfortunately, the responsibility rests with somebody else and not the person to whom we're speaking. So the Lord Advocate has specific responsibilities for some aspects of pathology services, but can't tell us which minister we should speak to specifically. And the Minister for Public Health and Women's Health has responsibility for hospital-arranged post-mortem examinations, but not otherwise. So there is an absence of ministerial leadership to oversee and drive forward overall improvements in pathology services. So I'm really asking, First Minister, if you would go away from today and perhaps consider allocating ministerial responsibility for death and bereavement, including pathology services, because there's a widespread agreement these changes could be made, but there doesn't seem to be anybody in government who is the lead responsibility willing to take it forward.
I accept the importance of the point that Mr Carlo makes, and I also say that it really, the government should be giving a focused and comprehensive response to the Citizens Participation in Public Petitions Committee. It should not be for the committee to try to join up the government. The government should be giving a response to. So for that, I don't like the sound of what Mr Carlo has put to me about the passing from pillar to post. That's not the way government should operate, and there should be very clear responses given to the issues raised by the committee. I, as First Minister, as a long-serving Member of Parliament, believe the petition system in the Scottish Parliament is a particular strength of the Parliament. It enables issues that members of the public are concerned about to be tested and considered by the committee, and potentially to change outcomes, which we have a long history of that happening over time. So I want to embrace that, approach, and for the government to play its part in responding to that. And I'm not comfortable with what Mr Carlow has said to me about the experience on this particular issue. So I will take that away and ask for the material to be put in front of me. I'm not familiar with that, but I will look at it. And certainly the committee should not encounter compartmentalised government. It's not what I believe in.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr Carlow. I've had a chance to catch up on some of the social media content. I mean, it may have been light-hearted in its intent, but I absolutely share your concerns about the fact that pictures of young people who are sitting in the public gallery have been put up on social media without their permission. So I hope those listening are reflecting on that and will take appropriate action. I'm conscious we've got a couple of areas still to cover and a number of colleagues who want to ask questions in those areas. I think it's inevitable we're going to overrun by 1:30, but I would want to aim to finish by 25 to 2 at the latest. Move to children and young people, and I call first Douglas Ross on behalf of Education, Children and Young People's Committee.
Thank you, Convener. First Minister, can I share with you an experience of a primary school teacher in Scotland who spoke to Channel 4 News just last month about the fact that she had been attacked on several occasions by pupils. She gave an example of a 10-year-old pupil who threatened her with scissors. This 10-year-old told her he would rip her heart out and make her bleed to death. The teacher said, "My life flashed before me." Can I ask, as a former Education Secretary, now First Minister, does violence in our schools and threats and physical actions like this give you sleepless nights?
Of course it does, yes.
How do you respond to a teacher here in Scotland who has not just cited this case, but the graphic detail of that is bad enough, but went on to narrate the fact that she has been attacked on several occasions in a primary school in Scotland?
I think that fundamentally, I acknowledge the challenging circumstances that members of the teaching profession will have to wrestle with within the education system. I think it's important that I put that in its proper context, that this will involve a minority of pupils, and it is essential that we have the arrangements in place, school by school, to ensure that members of staff and school pupils are safe when they come to school, because school must be a safe place for all individuals.
But do you accept that acts of violence and verbal abuse are on the increase in Scottish schools?
I think in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, there has been an increase in the level of challenging behaviour within schools, which is why the government has brought forward the behaviour action plan, which we've worked with our local authority partners who are responsible for the running of schools, to take the necessary steps to address that behaviour.
Are you aware of what it is across Scotland or in your own area, for example? Well,
there'll be there's data that's published on behaviour in school research, which is a matter of public record, and there is a necessity for us to take the action with our local authority partners to address that.
What is it in your own local authority?
I don't have data on.
Do you know it's almost doubled since 2019-20 in Perth and Kinross to 23-24, the instances of physical assault and verbal abuse against teachers and staff in your own local authority area, which you often cite when you're answering questions because you're a conscientious constituency MSP. It's almost doubled, going from 855 instances to 1,458. That must be of huge concern to you locally and nationally.
Which is why the government's taken the action with our local authority partners to put in place the steps on improving behaviour that are necessary.
And do you think it's working?
Well, we've obviously got a job of work on our hands to make sure that we strengthen the steps that we take to address that behaviour.
We don't have much time, so can I ask you on another issue? When did you first become aware that Dundee University was going to make 632 full-time equivalent jobs redundant?
The precise moment, I'm not sure I'll be able to...
The Scottish Government received their recovery plan on the 7th of March, so were you immediately informed?
Yes, I was. Yes.
So why then did you tell the Scottish Parliament on the 13th of March, almost a week later, that you were deeply involved in the discussions to ensure the future of Dundee University, the proposed plan was deeply troubling and the issue was right at the top of your agenda, but you knew that the money that the government were going to announce the following day going from 15 million to 25 million available to the SFC was not going to change the number of job losses at all?
Well, that's a premature conclusion for Mr Ross
well,
to arrive
it's not.
at.
If I can then, just to clarify that, the Scottish Funding Council told us on the record last Wednesday that the government were aware of the job losses, 632 FTE full-time equivalent, and they knew the request from Dundee University was for 22 million of the 25 million, and therefore if they got all of the money they asked for, it still wouldn't have changed the number of jobs under threat. So do you accept that? Because that's what the Scottish Funding Council told our committee.
Well, I think what the Funding Council told the committee was that the government considered the financial recovery plan from the University of Dundee and its implications not to be acceptable, which is why the Funding Council is working with the University of Dundee on alternatives to that financial recovery plan.
But you are aware of all of the money the Scottish Government have so far put forward that could be allocated to Dundee University will not in any way change the 632 FTE jobs that are under threat.
I don't accept that for 1 minute.
That's the evidence we've received, and that's what both Dundee University and... Because, well, if I can explain... Sorry, First Minister. Well, First Minister, if I can explain. Dundee University told us they asked for £22 million, I think in February. The government made £25 million available. But in March, on the 7th of March, they presented to you a recovery plan, even if they got the £22 million, that would still lead to 632 FTE job losses. You don't accept that?
I don't accept the financial recovery plan. No, I don't.
So what further funding are you going to provide?
It's not all about... It's not... Well, Mr Ross, there's a variety of different interventions and approaches that can be taken to stabilise the future of the University of Dundee, which I am absolutely determined will take its course. It will be done properly through the Funding Council, who legally have the responsibility to do that. The government will be supportive of the Funding Council. Indeed, yesterday I chaired a review meeting on the steps that have been taken in this respect. There's a lot of complex elements to that process, but the answer I gave in Parliament on the 13th of March, that this issue was at the top of my entry and focus of my attention, is absolutely correct. But what I will say is that I want to make sure that the government is supportive of the efforts taken forward by the Funding Council in consort with the University of Dundee to secure the future of the university, and that's my absolute intention.
Thank you, Convener.
Very much. And I call Colette Stevenson on behalf of the Social Justice, Social Security.
Thanks, Convener, and a very good afternoon, First Minister. So, I want to touch upon the lifting of the two-child cap and the work that we've done on eradicating child poverty within social justice. And just to make you aware, we have written 3 times to the Secretary of State, both Ian Murray and Liz Kendall, asking them to come forward to give evidence on a variety of areas that we can work on in terms of eradicating child poverty. And so far, they've refused. They have just up until now said that they'll provide a joint written submission, so I'll look forward to seeing that. However, I wanted to maybe get some more details from you about what the Scottish Government is doing with regards to lifting the two-child benefit and what progress has actually been made on accessing the data from the UK Government so far.
Well, we've taken forward the requests for information which we submitted, I think, the first information on that back in December, and the Cabinet receives an update periodically from the Social Justice Secretary on the steps that are being taken to gather that information and to engage with the Department of Work and Pensions and the United Kingdom Government, and also with His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and we are making progress on those data requests and on the steps that are required to take forward that commitment.
Okay, thank you. And in relation to reforms that have been announced on disability benefits, and I know you haven't been cited on the current spring statement, which is, I think, just completed as we speak. But could you maybe explain what the impact will be on the amount available for social security payments in Scotland following this recent announcement, and that and able to reduce spending on benefits as well for disabled people. And is the Scottish Government committed to maintaining that adult disability payment as well?
Well, as I said to the committee earlier, I'm not across the details of the Chancellor's statement that's been made to the House of Commons today. I obviously am familiar with the details that were announced by the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions last week, and I understand from media reports this morning, but I have no I don't know if these are been confirmed by the Chancellor, but they sounded authoritative this morning that there appeared to be further announcements that were being made in the course of this statement today, because the original proposals did not deliver the level of savings that the Office for Budget Responsibility did not judge that the original savings were delivered as anticipated. So I will be briefed on that later on this afternoon. Obviously, the implications, we have to carefully consider the implications of any of the changes that are necessary to the funding for the Scottish Government, because there stands to be the likelihood, I would imagine, of a block grant adjustment that will be negative in this respect. I'm not certain yet as to when that will have an effect on our budget. I don't expect it to have an effect in the 25-26 financial year for which Parliament has set a budget, but I don't know at what moment thereafter it is likely to have an effect at this stage. As I say, I'll be briefed when I conclude this session. In terms of the policy intention of the Government, clearly the Scottish Government wants to maintain the existing arrangements that we have in place in Scotland, because we judge them to be appropriate. So I have no intention, no plans to change the existing social security arrangements in Scotland, but I obviously have to be mindful of any budgetary implications that arise from the Chancellor's decisions.
Okay, thank you very much. And just lastly, based on the work that we undertook in terms of parental employment, I wanted to ask you about affordable childcare. Could you maybe give us some details about the measures that the Scottish Government is actually taking to ensure that parents are actually able to access affordable childcare to enable them to get back into work as well?
This is an essential part of the Best Start Bright Futures programme that the Government brings forward, where there are different elements to that. There will be the direct payments through the Scottish Child Payment, for example. There will be employability support that might be available, and there is the provision for travel support or housing support or early learning and childcare support. What I recognise is that early learning and childcare support can be critical to enabling young people, enabling families to be able to enter employment sustainably, and therefore that requires a degree of flexibility to be available at local level to enable that to be the case. Some of the pilot work that we are doing through the Early Adopters programme is showing us exactly how that can be done effectively and with wraparound care for families, and as part of the agenda to roll out that intervention to support our efforts to get people back into employment, the Government will of course look to work with our local authority partners on expanding the availability of such support.
Move on to Kenneth Gibson on behalf of the Finance Public Administration Committee.
Convener, and good afternoon, First Minister. Last October, the Institute for Fiscal Studies said, and I quote, that the single most important policy for reducing the number of children in poverty is removing the two-child limit. However, in the Sunday Times 3 days ago, the self-same IFS said that families with 3 children in receipt of this benefit could lose £7,500 a year in universal credit if they work for just 1 hour a week. So how will this benefit help families into work? How is it going to be sustainable given the likely content of today's statement by the Chancellor? And what is the opportunity cost of spending £155 million a year on removing the cap rather than, for example, clearing the deficits of integrated joint boards, boosting college funding, providing additional resources for local government, etc.?
suppose there's two aspects to that question. The first is that I think the Institute for Fiscal Studies is correct in their assessment of the damage that is done by the two-child limit, and that view is also echoed by a range of other organisations who are committed to the work on eradicating child poverty. Joseph Rowntree Foundation, for example, is another organisation. The Child Poverty Action Group will take a similar view. So I think the principle of boosting family incomes is critically understood as an essential means of strengthening family incomes to lift children out of poverty. So I think the mechanism is correct. I think Mr Gibson raises a fair point, which is about the interaction with the wider benefit system of the United Kingdom, and that's where we engage in discussion with the UK Government about ensuring, and I had this express conversation with the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions and the Secretary of State for Education about the child poverty review that is being undertaken by the UK Government, that I appealed to them to act in that process in a complementary fashion to what we are doing in the Scottish Government, rather than a contradictory fashion to what we are doing, and I hope that that appeal is responded to positively by the UK Government. The second point that Mr Gibson raises, which is entirely fair and reasonable, which is there's always a choice to be made about what public expenditure can be used for. There's no shortage of, Mr Gibson is a sage observer of all of these questions within Parliament, there's no shortage of demands for money to be spent in different ways, and indeed for the same money to be spent more than once on a particular question. And Government has to set out an orderly programme to Parliament through the budget process, and I am pleased that we have set that budget out to Parliament, and Parliament has supported it for the coming financial year.
Okay, thank you. I mean, what will the impact on Scotland of UK Government decisions to reduce the civil service workforce by 15% or more?
They depend on how that manifests itself in essentially consequential funding. So the consequences of UK Government decision making will essentially work their way through the comparability factors within the Barnett formula. So, for example, if the UK Government was to reduce civil service numbers and appropriate budgets within the Department for Education, for example, we would get 100% comparability on that. So we would essentially have our budget eroded by the comparable amount in the Barnett formula. If it was to be done, however, in the Ministry of Defence budget, there would be no impact on the Scottish Government budget because we have a 0% comparability factor. So it really depends on where that decision making is applied within the United Kingdom Government, how that plays into budgets. And I think we won't see, we've got a budget set for 25-26. I'm not aware of any changes that affect the budget from the spring statement. I would be very surprised if the spring statement was to result in a negative impact on the 25-26 budget. I'd be very surprised, given that the financial year starts in about a week's time. But then these decisions may flow into the spending review from the United Kingdom Government that we will hear about in June, which will then potentially have an effect from 26-27 onwards. Now, that then affects the decision-making of the Scottish Government on the size of our budget priorities, I should say, and the issues that Mr Gibson put to me in his first question are relevant in that respect. I should, for completeness, say that in the last 2 years, I think, yes, between March 2022 and December 2024, the total workforce of the core Scottish Government reduced by 4%. So we're already, taking steps to reduce the size of the workforce.
Okay. Now, earlier we touched on increased national employer national insurance contributions will cost the public sector £549 million directly in the next financial year, and the UK Government has partially mitigated that to the tune of around £300 million. Now, I put a question to the Chief Secretary of Treasury last week, and he was somewhat ambiguous in his response, and it was whether or not that's been barnetised so that it's going to effectively be part of our budget for each ongoing year, or whether you have to renegotiate that £300 million. I think that's obviously a very significant issue given the impact it has on our public sector. So I just wonder if you can enlighten us in any way.
I think the question, and I don't know the answer to this question yet, is whether that sum of money has been baselined. That's the key question.
Exactly, that's the point I asked.
And now, there will be now. That is the key question. Will it be baselined? And I don't know the answer to that question, because that obviously has a potential effect of on future financial years. I would expect that we will have had confirmation in the statement today about the level of amelioration that has been put in place from the UK Government. I'd be very surprised if we haven't got that clarified today. But the question for future years is whether... Now, I don't think that's going to be adequate. I'd be surprised if it's adequate to compensate for the impact for the public sector, and certainly for the breadth of the public sector, given that we talked earlier about social care organisations. But it will be... The key question is what's the effect on further financial years.
Yeah, and local authorities will expect to be baseline. Just lastly, Convener, it's just about
it will have to be very, very brief.
It is actually. It's just that many of our universities are struggling with the precipitous decline in overseas student numbers. The tuition fee for Scottish students has been stuck at £1,820 a year for the last 15 years, and research and development funding is declining relative to the rest of the UK. So given how critical our universities are to Scotland and having a globally competitive economy, what more will the Scottish Government do to support these vital
as briefly as possible, First Minister?
As I've confirmed at First Minister's questions, and indeed the Higher Education Minister confirmed at topical questions yesterday, we are and will be engaged with the university sector on discussions about ensuring that the sector is able to maintain the leading position that it currently occupies, because that's a huge economic asset for Scotland.
Okay, I've got a couple of colleagues still wishing to ask questions. We're going to come first to Can Adam on behalf of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. Can.
Thank you, Convener, and good afternoon, First Minister. First Minister, yesterday my committee had a very powerful private session with autistic disabled people. And they told us about the crisis that they're having in assessment, diagnosis and post-diagnostic support. They also set out in very impactful terms the opportunities that disabled people are missing out on and the burnouts that they're suffering from. And they wanted me to ask you today what the Scottish Government is doing to respond to this crisis. But moreover, they really wanted reassurance that they were a part of that process, that they could feed into that crisis. They felt strongly that the consultation for the Learning Disabilities, Autism and Neurodivergence Bill had put organisations' voices, but perhaps not their own. They felt their own voices weren't reflected in that. So, in absence of the LDAM bill, what can the Scottish Government do or give reassurance to autistic disabled people that they will be at the centre of designing any process for this crisis, but that the Scottish Government is doing something to help them?
I'm obviously on the point in principle about the role of people with autism, learning disabilities. I want to make sure that people are well supported, and that, for example, in the recent budget we put additional financial support into the education system to support pupils with additional support needs as part of the programme. In relation to the Learning Disabilities, Autism and Neurodivergence Bill, I'm concerned to hear the feedback from Karen Adam on this question, because we did involve those with lived experience in a number of ways in the consultation about that bill. Particularly, I think we drew on their content and their experience and perspective in approving the consultation process and then in some of the panels that discussed the contents of that bill. So it's really very important that we hear those voices, and I do appreciate the distinction that Karen Adam makes between the voices of those with lived experience and organisations that may be involved in this area. So it's important that we hear all of those voices as part of that process. But I will take away that point and test just exactly why that's the evidence that the committee has heard.
Thank you, First Minister. If I may, my second question. The committee has been concerned about the non-implementation of all or some of the provisions in the Female Genital Mutilation Protection and Guidance Scotland Act 2020, the Children's Scotland Act 2020 and the Domestic Abuse Protection Scotland Act 2021, and the impact that delay is having on those the legislation is meant to protect. The committee is continuing to pursue this issue with both the Minister for Parliamentary Business and relevant ministers, but we would be really grateful for any reassurance that you could give the committee that the implementation of these provisions will be expedient and they will not regularly see legislation passed but not implemented.
Well, we certainly, I'm very happy to look at the particular proposals that Karen has raised with me. Obviously, we've got to schedule necessary, if there's further parliamentary instruments required, that all has to be scheduled into Parliament. And of course, Mr Carson has raised some of the practical issues about that with me. If Parliament has passed legislation, we should get on with implementing it and to make sure that it makes the impact that Parliament has determined it should make.
Thanks, Karen. And finally, Audrey Nicholl on behalf of the Criminal Justice Committee.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good afternoon, First Minister, and apologies for my late arrival. So I'd like to start with national insurance and the justice system, and I know that national insurance is an issue that has already been raised by a colleague this morning. So obviously we know the UK Government has made significant changes to employer national insurance contributions and thresholds, and these will have a significant impact on staffing costs in key parts of the justice system, such as policing and prisons. How will the Scottish Government address these financial pressures, particularly given the volume of legislation currently being scrutinised by the Criminal Justice Committee, including the Victims and Witnesses and Justice Reform Bill and the Criminal Justice Modernisation Bill, that is likely to require a significant staff resource commitment and requirement?
We obviously do that by the financial provisions that we've put in place for the various aspects of the criminal justice system across Police Scotland, the Courts and Tribunal Service and the Crown Office. We have put in place increases in the budget to enable those organisations to be able to meet the challenges that are faced because of employers' national insurance contribution increases and other factors which may arise out of the work that the committee is scrutinising. So the budget settlements, which I think were particularly strong this year for the Police, Courts and Tribunal Service and the Crown Office, will help us to address those issues.
Okay, thank you very much. I wonder if I can move on now to an issue that Karen Adam has touched on, non-implementation of legislation and the unintended consequences. Now, as the First Minister knows, the Criminal Justice Committee scrutinises a significant volume of acts. One such act was the Children, Care and Justice Scotland Act of 2024. A key provision in this act was that young people will no longer be held in young offenders institutions and should now be held in secure care. And to make this happen, we need to have sufficient spaces in secure care settings and resources made available so that they can be adapted to care for and meet the often complex needs of potentially more challenging young people and violent offenders. So can I ask what steps is the Scottish Government taking to ensure sufficient secure care capacity to meet this shift in demand, and specifically how is the Government addressing the potential increase in secure care placements and ensuring that the necessary resources and infrastructure are in place to support these changes?
There is a parliamentary statement by the Minister later on this afternoon, so I better be careful about. I'm not quite sure the status of this gathering as to whether it's a formal meeting of Parliament, so I better just err on the side of caution about not disclosing the contents of that statement. But the issues, I think there's a point which I think I've rehearsed with Parliament at First Minister's questions. Because Parliament has legislated for the Care and Justice Scotland Act 2024, I think there's which, as Audrey Nicholl correctly says, means it is no longer possible for any young person under the age of 18 to be imprisoned normally in the Young Offenders Institution at Polmont. There is what follows for me an obligation on the government to, in the past, that capacity existed to accommodate young people. Parliament has said that's no longer acceptable, and I am absolutely delighted about that. What flows from that is that we've got to make sure we've got adequate and appropriate secure care facilities to where they are required and necessary. And that issue, so I accept that point in principle, and that we can't leave it to chance, we can't leave it to the market to decide all these things. We have to intervene in that respect, and that will be the subject in the context of the statement that the Minister for Children and Young People gives to Parliament this afternoon.
Thank you. I'm grateful for that update. And if I may, a very quick follow-on question.
Yeah.
So the Scottish Parliament has a new duty to report on the implementation of the UNCRC, with the first report due in July 2025. So in light of this, how is the Scottish Government ensuring that justice provisions affecting children, such as those set out in the Children Care and Justice Act, align with Scotland's obligations under the Convention, particularly regarding secure care and children's rights within the justice system? And I accept the First Minister might refer to the statement this afternoon.
Well, we have to, because of the passage of that legislation, we have to satisfy ourselves across a whole range of different policy areas that we are acting and we're positioned to be operating within the expectations of the framework that the UNCRC puts in place, because we are required by law to do so. So we have to, now there will be, the government will essentially look at its range of obligations and its approaches to make sure that it is doing so. Obviously, the UNCRC legislation creates the means and the mechanism whereby the government can be challenged in the courts by individuals if they determine that we're not acting in that fashion, and that obviously can lead to a requirement potentially for a change of practice, but that's only arising out of the government being found by a court not to be compliant with the UNCRC. And we should avoid that by ensuring that in a review of existing obligations and commitments, we are acting in a fashion that's consistent with the law.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much. Thank you, First Minister. That concludes the session. Can I thank you for your time, First Minister? Look forward to arranging a time to have you back, probably in September, but thank you for now. Our next meeting is Wednesday the 30th of April, and an agenda will be circulated in due course, but thank you all for your attendance, and I close the meeting. Thank you.